Good Lord, YouTube. What's going on out there? Hope this video finds you safe and well. I'm Mike, and this is my channel, Solid State Alchemy. I've got bright lights, whew, and I'm in my basement, in the underbelly of the YouTube algorithm, and today we're going to talk about processors, specifically ones that are nearly, almost exactly 10 years old. I got close. I meant to have this video out like a month ago, but didn't happen. So that's okay. We're still going to talk about them. So the one on my left is Intel's first desktop 6-core processor, namely the i7-980X, and it's on the X58 chipset and the LGA 1366 socket, and it's an Intel Extreme processor, they call them, and it's the first one released on the Nehalem architecture, microarchitecture. It's a smaller process node than the original, other than the preceding Extreme processors. So that's what's under that heatsink right there, and it's sitting on an Asus. What is this guy? It's an Asus P6 X58D Premium motherboard, 8 GB of RAM, and Intel Performance cooler. And then the Challenger, the modern day Challenger, coming in at roughly, so board to board, RAM to RAM, cooler to cooler, processor to processor, all combined, coming in at roughly 25% of the original cost of this is the newest 6-core 12-thread processor, the same as the 980X, from AMD. And no, it's not a 3000 series part. It is the AMD Ryzen 5 1600. But Mike, the 1600 came out like 3.5 years ago. This is the 1600AF. And if you follow tech channels, you've probably seen it mentioned that there's a new 1600 series, and it's based on the 12 nanometer Zen Plus architecture as opposed to the original Zen 1 that the first 1600 was on. I don't know why AMD decided that they were going to just call it the 1600 again. It's just a refresh, but it's a good refresh, and it's $85 for a CPU, for a 6-core 12-thread CPU. When this CPU came out, significantly more than that. I think it was bucking $500 for the 980X, maybe more. I didn't really dig around what the original MSRP was. It was expensive by today's standards, or even by then, by previous day standards. But what we're going to do is we're going to walk through some productivity benchmarks comparing a 10-year-old, almost to the day, I got it close, it's like a month off, 6-core 12-thread processor to one of the newest, if not the newest, 6-core 12-thread processor on the block in productivity and some gaming. And testing methodology, as always, is the same. 3 runs back to back, no break, no rest for the weary, and then average the 3, and then we'll talk about it. Both of these CPUs were paired with my Zotac 980 Ti Amp Extreme Edition, and therefore I generally have to do all of the video game benchmarks on low settings. A different flavor, a different twist is because I have a new monitor. You might see my auction haul video. I didn't initially intend to use this monitor for video game, benchmarks, but it's just the way it happens because my wife is working from home, and she's absconded with my main 1080p monitor. So now the video games are in 1440p because that's what I got to work with. Ultra wide 1440p, all low settings. Didn't really seem to skew the numbers very much one way or the other. So let's get into it. So in this corner, the 10-year, still highly sought after, still very expensive x58 platform 980X versus the newcomer, the Ryzen 5 1600AF. Cinebench R15 is our first productivity benchmark program we're going to talk about. So the i9 or the i7 980XE returned a Cinebench R15 score of 791 points, which is fine. I mean, that's, by today's standards, it's still like usable. But the Ryzen 5 1600 returned an average score of 1,264 points, and that is a margin of nearly 60%. 59.7% is the gap on the performance of this 6-core 12-thread versus that 6-core 12-thread. And then moving on to Cinebench R20, the newer test based on different photo editing microcode or whatever. The i7 980X returns a score of 1,657, and the Ryzen 5 1600AF returns a score of 2,850. So that means that the delta on the newer benchmark between the older CPU and the newer CPU is 73%. It's pretty staggering. How far have we come in 10 years? 73% basically. And not only that, this isn't comparing the newest high-end, i9 10980X or whatever to a 980X. This is comparing the cheapest 6-core AMD makes currently to the 980X. So top of the stack from 10 years ago versus nearly the bottom of the stack. The only thing lower than this in the product stack from AMD is a Ryzen 3 3200G or something like that. Moving on to Cinebench, or I'm sorry, not Cinebench, Asus RealBench. Let me get some fortifying, keep myself healthy here, sanitize my insides. Asus RealBench. I like this benchmark because it has video editing, photo editing, heavy multi-threading, multitasking parts to it. It really works your CPUs over well. So, image editing, the 980X returns 122,476, a hearty score, even by today's modern CPU standards. But the i5 1600 or the Ryzen 5 1600 still bests it with a score of 142,000, with a delta of nearly 16%. Encoding is a place where the 980XE really, or the 980X really does shine. It really does. It's still a strong CPU when it comes to encoding instruction sets. Returned a score of 127,000 plus, compared to 121,000 plus on the Ryzen 5 here. So it gets in the win column. Intel in the win column with a 5% margin of victory. We're going to give it to the old guy, the old stallion here, the old warhorse. OpenCL, which is like, a 3D graphics rendering, 3D animation rendering type workload. The Ryzen 5 takes it by 7%. Not a huge win, but a win nonetheless for Team Red. Heavy multitasking in the Asus RealBench. The Ryzen 5, again, another slim lead, 7% margin of victory. I mean, it's victory. It's consistently well ahead of the 980X, but not as crushingly as like the Cinebench scores would lead you to believe. And then the overall system score, and this takes in the RAM and the GPU and everything all together. The Ryzen 5 returns a 26% victory, 123,000 to 97,000 for the 980X. So overall, A very convincing win for our modern 6-core 12-thread processor here. PC Mark, this is, you know, again, I say this every video. I got to do my homework and dig into what these benchmarks actually mean and compare to each other. But I'm just going to focus on the biggest difference, right? The biggest takeaway here. The Ryzen 5 won the overall, and the biggest win it had in the subcategories for PC Mark was for digital content creation. And it won that particular category by 28.7, you know, so nearly 29, nearly 30%. For however PC Mark grades that or gauges that. And then productivity and essentials, I don't know what those mean particularly for the PC Mark software writers, but it still got a win, you know, double-digit percentage win over our trusty steed here on the left from Intel. All right, moving on into some games. So, well, not quite a game. Firestrike is a synthetic gaming benchmark, and it is not always indicative of how well your system will actually perform in games based on different, you know, engines and so forth. But for Firestrike, again, total overall, it's a win for Team Red. The blue team couldn't quite get her done there. So total score, the Ryzen 5 wins by about 14%. But the physics score is the physics score and the combined scores are what you really should look at. The graphics scores, the 980 Ti was doing its thing. And it didn't care whether it was a 980X feeding it frames or a Ryzen 5 1600 feeding it frames. But if the game supports, you know, CPU accelerated physics and particle physics and etc., you're going to see some inconsistencies, let's just say, if you're running with the 980X. The physics score delta is 46%. So if you're playing a game, Borderlands 2 comes to mind right off the bat, but I'm sure there are more with a lot of CPU accelerated physics or PhysX. If you don't have an additional PhysX graphics card or a graphics card powerful enough to handle the particle physics, it offloads it to the CPU. You're going to struggle. You're going to struggle with games like Ashes of the Singularity that are really CPU intensive. Also, I think Civilization's turn time is really going to get hammered if you're running on something like this. Versus, I mean, this will still play it, no issues, but versus this, it's no contest, right? The Ryzen 5 is just going to walk away with it every time. And a combined score in the 3D Mark benchmark of 36% basically win over for the Ryzen 5 over the 980X. And then we're going to go into the actual games. So the first game up is Rainbow Six Siege. So it's a win for the red team. Let's get it out of the way, right? In the minimum frames or low frame averages for the Rainbow Six Siege benchmark, this gets a 71% increase. It's 92 frames per second, I'm sorry, versus 56 frames a second for your lows, for your low FPS average, right? Average FPS, 20% win, and then high FPS, this one only gets about 5% win, but I think that's really more the 980 Ti crapping out. Remember, this is 1440p low. And so here's a different game that I haven't done in any previous videos because it was released just shortly after the 980X, and that is Fallout New Vegas. This one I did have to do in 1080p. I had to force the monitor to take that resolution. It didn't like it really because New Vegas just doesn't support 1440p, right? So The biggest takeaway here is on its home turf, basically a 2010 game for a 2010 processor. You know, the 980X actually gets the win for this guy. They both, well, okay, New Vegas is frame capped at 60. They both get you a 60 FPS average. No issues, right? It's the minimums and the 1% lows you have to look at. Now, remember, or I should advise you, that this is not strictly an apples to apples comparison. The 980 and the X58 require that I make a separate MBR formatted hard drive for my Windows installation, as opposed to a GPT and using my straight up my usual benchmark testing hard drive for modern CPUs, right? So that's why the game data is kind of pared down a little bit. So what that means is this is not the same two installations of New Vegas. And what happened was, when I was running New Vegas, and I tried to make it the exact same route through the town and up into the desert and back again every time, but on the GPT, on my benchmark installation of New Vegas, there was one point every time I would get to the corner of the saloon or whatever it is, it would just tank. It would just like absolutely freeze, hiccup, whatever you want to call it, and the 1% lows would drop down to 9%, right? Whereas on the MBR installation of New Vegas on my other hard drive, I don't know. It never happened. It didn't. This returned to 27 frame per second average on New Vegas for the 1% lows. That's the 1% low tracking, right? So 27 to 9. You know what? It's been getting hammered this entire review. I'm going to give it the win. Give it the win in New Vegas for the 1% lows, for the 0.1% lows, I should say. For the 1% lows, it's basically a crapshoot. It's 52 to 54, and then they tied at 60 for the FPS. So if you're playing a 10-year-old game, this 10-year-old processor still gets it done. No better or no worse. Actually, I should say no. This is no better for a 10-year-old game than this is. I'm not sure what that means. So a new video game in our benchmark lineup here is The Witcher 3. I know it's not a new video game. It's new to me. In these videos. So 1440p low, Witcher 3. Yeah. Again, the 1600 it's just taking it to the 980X. I didn't know this was going to go this way when I lined up this comparison. I figured that they would be actually really comparable to each other, but turns out they are not very comparable to each other. So 1% lows, 1440p. Or I'm sorry, the minimum frame rate. I don't know. I'm not sure really what the difference between minimum frame rate, 1% low, 0.1% low. But let's just talk about them all, right? Minimum frame rate for this versus this, delta of 28%, and 0.1% low, delta of 40%, and 1% low, delta of 36%, for a landslide, crushing victory for the Ryzen 5 1600 AF over the 980X in Witcher 3. Even at 1440p, when you typically start to see the CPU not really matter as much because the GPU is getting hammered, and when you take it down to low, the 90 Ti still plenty fast enough. Needs these guys to shovel frames pretty quick. Max FPS was really not. There was barely 5 frames a second in it. Average FPS, again, 6 frames a second in it. But it's the smoothness, right? The consistency, the frame time, and the frame pacing, and the 0.1% and 1% lows, where you really notice that the 1600 is just smooth as silk, and the 980X is struggling to keep up, even at 1440p, serving frames to a 980 Ti. right? And the last video game benchmark that I'm going to talk about is Metro Last Light Redux. It's an older game again, but it's got a benchmark built in that you can run consistently. It returns consistent results, so it's good to think of as a benchmark to give you some in-game, compare it across the board here. So on this one in particular, the surprising thing is on the minimum frame rate, the 980X in Last Light Redux was about a 10%, almost 11% advantage over the 1600. So, yay, I'm going to give it to the 980 again on that one. And then, but for the average and the max frames, the 1600 pulls away again. So this, interestingly enough, on that game, on Metro Last Light Redux, the 980 Ti provides a little bit more stable of a foundation. Its minimum frame rate doesn't go down nearly as far as the 1600, but the 1600 pulls away with a higher average and a higher overall frame rate. So let's talk about some conclusions, right? And like some value. Right now, I don't understand why the X58 platform and the 980 and the 990X are so sought after. They have been consistently knocked down, and it's not their fault. They started off as really good chips, but Intel, with their security breaches and their patches, have really degraded the performance of not just the 980X and the X58 platform, but all of the Core i series, and multiple generations of those series have been affected by those Spectre and Meltdown and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and the resulting patches to make them safe. All those patches have reduced the performance. AMD hasn't suffered quite so badly there. I mean, it's had its own issues, but it's definitely not taken the performance hit on a 1-to-1 ratio compared to Intel. So over the years, you have the AMD fine wine phenomenon where they release a graphics card, the drivers are terrible, but the drivers get better over time, and the graphics card looks like it's getting better over time because it's realizing its initial potential. I think in this particular instance, you have Intel, across a wide range of CPUs, older Intel CPUs that were released, fully formed, very capable, extremely fast, extremely competent and capable, but over the years, as we found the chinks in their armor, or hackers found the chinks in their armor, and they had to be pasted over, the performance has definitely slid on a downward trend. I definitely see that when I look at like the i7 4770K. Back in the day, if you could get that thing to 4.5 or 4.6 gigahertz, it was just a world beater. It didn't matter if it was going up against a 6700 or an 8700K. Really, the performance was there. But because of all these patches, you've seen a gradient of reduced performance through the years for a wide array of Intel processors. So at this point in time, based on the value proposition, it makes no sense to me to go after an older Intel CPU based rig. If you're building a rig from scratch, there's no incentive based on price to performance to go and look for a 980X or a 3770 or a 4770K. They just don't offer the price to performance value of a brand new Ryzen system. This is the bottom, or nearly the bottom of the SKU stack for AMD right now, and it mops the floor with these older Intel chips that, for some unknown reason, still go for more than this chip goes. I'm telling you, you can't buy a 4770K or a 3770K for what you can buy a Ryzen 5 1600AF for. And it's mind-boggling why those chips are still so expensive and so sought after, and why a Z97 or a Z87 motherboard goes for more than this B450 Micro ATX from MSI. This is a great board. It's got an awesome VRM. It will overclock the bejabbers out of this chip or a 3900X with no complaints. I don't understand why Intels are still so sought after based on this comparison in particular, but on, and we'll get into some different ones here, but again, this setup here, even today, used, 10 years old, cost more than this setup right here. And I have deal hunted for quite a while, right? People are still charging more for a 980X, or still wanting more for a 980X than the retailers want for a 1600 AF, and this is by far and away the more capable CPU. I don't get it. And on that bombshell, so I love Jeremy Clarkson. Please stay away from human malware, Jeremy Clarkson. We need you. So again, I'm Mike. This is my channel, Solid State Alchemy. Like and subscribe for more content. I promise I'm going to try to do better with recording and getting this stuff out to you guys. You can follow me. I'll put a link in the description below for Twitter and Facebook. And please, 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 if you want to interact with me in any meaningful fashion, I am always on my Discord channel. Big shout out to my guys on my Discord channel, my faithful few. You guys are awesome. I'm constantly posting pictures and taking questions and just chatting people up about computer parts on the Discords. I like it much better than most of the other social media platforms out there. Yeah. So again, AMD 10-year-old flagship platform. We got the results. We know the deal. I'm Mike. Solid State Alchemy. I'm out.